remember to sit still, move backwards, disappear into, well, logos. I did that like they're behind me, they're not. Before I hand over to Rob Weaver, the Deputy Chief Executive at Tewkesbury Council, I just want to run through some of the housekeeping rules for our virtual session. When not speaking, please ensure your camera is off and your microphone is muted to avoid background noise during the session. We will be recording this session to share with all delegates after, so please keep this in mind when posting in the chat. If for any reason your internet or laptop connection fails, please note down the dial-in details that can be found under the 3 dots as a meeting options tab, and Neil has also put the details in the chat, so you can call into the session. And also please use the chat function during the session, thoughts, comments and questions, and we will respond to these at the end of the session if there's time. You can also use the raise your hand function to ask any questions at the end, but just a pre-warning, I'm not seeing everyone's hands being raised when they are, so you might have to shout out at the end if you've got your hand up and I'm just completely ignoring you. But that's all of our housekeeping rules, so I'll just hand over to Rob now, who's going to be presenting on leading a team through a COVID crisis.
Thanks very much, Nicola. Can you hear and see me okay?
Yep, let me get your slide.
Good stuff. That's the first hurdle overcome.
Oh, it's gone.
Can you see your slides now?
Bear with me. Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much indeed. Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Rob Weaver, Deputy Chief Executive at Tewkesbury Borough Council. For the next 35-40 minutes or so, I'm just going to take you through my personal journey into the COVID crisis. I made the mistake of writing an article in EHN that Nicole and the team saw, and they then decided to give me a ring and said, would you mind doing a session at our Week of Wonder? So that'll teach me to write things in publications. But no, joking aside, it's really good to be part of this session, and hopefully I can share with you some of the trials and tribulations over the next half hour or so that I've been facing, along with many of you as public sector organisations over the last 8 or 9 months. So first slide, please, Nicole. Okay, so first thing I just wanted to say, and excuse me because I'm going to bring a few notes up as well, so I may or may not start to look all over the screen. The first thing that struck me as part of the COVID crisis, which I'm sure struck a lot of you as well, is this is emergency planning, but not as we know it. And I think in the early days, Tewkesbury Borough Council, along with lots of other councils and lots of public sector organisations, very quickly stood up their emergency planning teams and their works teams. We created the virtual work environment because obviously we were working remotely. And we tried to tackle this in much the same way as we would a fire, a chemical spill, or any other sort of emergency planning incident. And I think one of the first things that struck me was actually this isn't an emergency in the same way as a lot of the planning that we do for such eventualities. COVID has been really different, and the approach that we took at the outset was quite clear we weren't going to be able to see that approach through in the long term. So we had to think very carefully about how we actually decided to run the emergency as part of the COVID crisis management as time went on. And one of the things which was a particular worry to myself and the other senior managers here at Tewkesbury was clearly we were faced with a pandemic on the front line, but we were also, like a lot of public sector areas, faced with what we refer to, or what I refer to, back office emergency. Now, what I mean by that is clearly we were tasked with standing up a remote working platform. Myself and the CEO were responsible for looking at how we very quickly migrated 95% of our systems, our operating systems, online. We needed to quickly procure hundreds of extra laptops, make sure staff were trained and were able to work remotely, which was creating us with a real headache. So concurrently with trying to deal with the frontline emergency, we also had what we referred to as the back office emergency. and we were struggling with bandwidth. Clearly, like a lot of local authorities, we weren't in a position to immediately be able to set up 95% of our staff to work from home, and we didn't have a sufficient bandwidth, we found quite quickly, to enable us to do that. So we had lots of sleepless nights with our IT teams, making sure that we were trying to overcome some of those issues around bandwidth problems. And for me, that was one of the critical parts of the journey, was we were faced with an emergency planning scenario, but also faced with the redesign of the way we were delivering those services. And again, that's something which is quite different when we consider it to how we roll out a number of emergency planning scenarios. And the other thing which struck us as being very different very early on is clearly most emergency planning is physical in nature. It's responding to a chemical spill or a fire, or in Tewkesbury's case, flooding quite regularly. But one of the key issues we had here was we were acting as government messengers, and we were very quickly having to mobilise teams to deal with business grants, community grants and discretionary grants payments. That was something which was new to us. And we needed to very quickly mobilise lots of our finance teams and our admin teams to be able to process those grants really, really quickly and deal with a huge amount of calls that were coming in. And concurrently with dealing with lots of business grants, we were also, like many local authorities, seeing a huge increase in the number of council tax reduction applications. So the amount of paperwork that was coming into the organisation was exponential, and it increased significantly over our normal workloads. So we needed to find a way of quite quickly mobilising lots of teams to deal with the back office emergency, as we like to call it. And again, one of the things which struck me quite early on is our traditional approach of looking to use specific teams. So, for example, it's usually environmental health or community services who are best placed to mobilise and be out and about within the community dealing with a traditional emergency. We were very much needing to use our back office officers to do that. And we simply didn't have enough finance teams or enough Revs and Bens officers or enough of our economic development officers to be able to work in isolation to try and process the amount of grants and grant applications that were coming through. So one of the things which we did quite early on, which worked really, really well, was to create what we called response cells. And by that, what we were doing is setting up a group of individuals with complementary skill sets to work together as a virtual team. So we had our finance team working really, really closely with our Revs and Bens team, and we had our economic development officers working closely with finance and Revs and Bens. And collectively, that team was brought together in what we classed as our business cell, with a view to being able to process those applications in the most efficient way. And clearly, the economic development officers had a huge database of local businesses, so we were able to provide that to the finance officers. The finance officers and Revs and Bens officers had really good links into the valuation office and other back office systems. And those teams came together and worked really, really well. And it was interesting, in the early days, they didn't quite know how to function together. They'd not been brought together in that environment before. But one of the early successes for me in particular was this creation of those cells. And it really allowed us to break down those silos. But more importantly, it allowed those individuals with complementary skill sets to work and help each other out to best effect. We'd not done that within Tewkesbury before, and we then decided to reflect that cell approach and developed a community cell who were very much responsible for looking at manning the help hub portals that were set up across the country, whereby shielding and vulnerable individuals were put in contact with those volunteers that were best placed to be able to help them. And one of the things which I'm bringing away from the crisis is actually local authorities don't necessarily always force that particular situation and put people together with those complementary skill sets and look to get them to work together. We all talk about breaking down silos, and we all think we're probably quite good at breaking down those silos, but actually there are still quite a few silos operating within many organisations. But by creating those response cells, we were really able to break down some of those silos. So one of the lessons learned for me is how we take that method forward and that approach forward as we start to talk about recovery. And I'll come on to a bit of that a little bit later. Next slide, please. Again, one of the things I touched on in the EHN article that I wrote a few months ago was around how we provide really effective leadership in times of crisis. And this is one of the areas which I don't mind admitting and sharing. Really, really difficult for me, because again, in a traditional emergency planning scenario, which we can all train for, we provide that command and control type leadership where we're overseeing works teams, and we're either sitting on silver, gold, or on a tactical level, and we're inputting and using the benefit of our experience to best direct teams on the ground in terms of managing that particular emergency. But COVID clearly wasn't a typical emergency. And for me as a leader, I felt at times quite powerless. I was expected to lead those various teams, and yet this was new territory for me as well. So rather than being able to lead from the front, as is often the case in some emergency planning scenarios, I just took a bit of time to consider how I could really add value to those teams that were on the front line or that were manning Help Hub portals 24 hours a day and over weekends, and what added value I could bring to them to demonstrate leadership in that particular way. And I think it's at times like this where good leaders will look to see what added value will really support their teams. And I think that can be summed up as oiling the cogs or making things happen in the background. So it's not about being front and center of a particular issue. It's not around trying to have all the answers. It's around looking behind the scenes at what particular elements can really make a difference and heading those off at the pass. And a couple of examples that I'd just like to share with you, which hopefully demonstrate that, is again, I mentioned the business cell dealing with lots of business grants. They were also quite naturally getting lots of repeat inquiries from people who didn't meet the criteria for government grants for one reason or another. And those people were often at their wits' end. They were in very emotional states. Sometimes they were suicidal, and they were complaining, and they were saying that it wasn't fair that they weren't able to get those grants. And without those grants, their businesses could go under, and they may lose their homes. And it's some really, really difficult conversations that the staff were having. But from sitting in on some of those team meetings and asking the staff some of those questions, it transpired that actually what people were really concerned about was the fact that the government criteria didn't enable them to be eligible for a grant. So they weren't upset or cross with the council per se. It was the fact that they were frustrated that the government system didn't allow them to be entitled to those grants. So I took away a bit of information from that conversation. I had a word with our local MP and said, look, we're getting lots of inquiries that we're not able to do anything around. It's taking up lots of time of my business cell staff. But fundamentally, these individuals and businesses are frustrated with the government system. Can we look at working together on this? So any complaints or any concerns that are coming through authority, which are actually related far more to hopefully trying to make changes to the government grant system, would be far better directed to you and your office than they would be to the business cell team, because they're pretty much powerless to do anything around the criteria that government have set. And luckily for me and the teams, the MP was really quite open to that suggestion. So what we did is we set up a process whereby any of those complaints or inquiries came to me, and I was able then to forward them on to the MP's offices, and the MP responded to those and said that he would take those up with ministers and look to see whether there was anything that could be done. Now, that was quite a small example of me literally seeing that the staff were taking a lot of time answering calls and inquiries that they couldn't do anything about. But by just giving them some leadership and having that conversation with the MP and being then able to divert quite a lot of that workload elsewhere, really helped that business team be able to get on with the job in hand and process those applications. And they were able to process, like lots of authorities, over 90 million odd pounds worth of business grants in a relatively short space of time, simply by me providing that little bit of leadership behind the scenes to be able to divert some of that work stream elsewhere. I think that's just really a small example of where leadership in the background can pay dividends in these kind of environments. The other thing which I was able to do for some of the staff who were involved in some really, really difficult conversations not only from a business perspective, but also with some of our communities, where shielding and vulnerable individuals hadn't been able to go out. They weren't able to see their friends and family. And in a lot of cases, the council staff looking to connect them with volunteers was the only friendly voice that they heard, certainly in the early days of lockdown, for a significant period of time. And again, a lot of those individuals felt very vulnerable, very lonely, very isolated, and a lot of them felt quite suicidal as well. And again, from sitting in on some of the conversations with the officers taking those calls, it was quite apparent that those officers and their mental health and well-being was taking a battering, and something needed to be done to give them the opportunity to offload and to have some conversations with professionals, because otherwise they were going to take a lot of these problems home, and it was clearly not going to be something which would help their own mental health and well-being. So I had a conversation with the HR manager, and again, a relatively small thing, but we put in place some online mental health training and set that up to run consecutively over a number of days during a lunch hour, which allowed the maximum amount of staff to be able to and really have a conversation around some of those very difficult calls that they were dealing with, and to get some advice about the best way to deal with those calls from the experts. Now, the take up for that mental health online training was phenomenal, and around 90% of our frontline staff involved in those difficult conversations were taking up the opportunity to have those conversations. And then from doing some feedback, they said that it really helped them be able to deal with some of those difficult conversations, compartmentalize it where necessary, but more importantly, have some respite and some opportunity to offload some of those difficult conversations. So it was a relatively small piece of work that made a big difference. And the final example about, I think, leadership really makes a difference is in taking time to listen to staff. And again, me, like a lot of local authority leaders, we feel that we should have all the answers, and we like to provide solutions to people's problems. But I made a big point of logging on to lots of the individual team meetings, and the only question I had for some of those staff was, how is remote working for you, and what further support might you need from me? And I remember one very poignant conversation I had with the housing team, and one of the housing officers said to me, I'm working from home, I've got a small house, and I'm working from my kitchen table, and I'm also trying to manage childcare duties at the same time. And he was saying to me at the end of some of these conversations, "Are you okay, mummy?" That sounded like quite a difficult conversation. And then the housing officer told me that she was having difficult conversations with tenants that may be faced with eviction, or tenants who may not be eligible for some form of local authority assistance. And some of those conversations quite naturally became quite difficult. And yet her little daughter was picking up on those and worrying that her mum was being stressed or was being put in a difficult position through doing her job. And that really resonated with me. And one of the things that followed on the back of that was when we were able to open up our council offices for a small number of staff, rather than having a one-size-fits-all approach where we may have said, okay, we'll ask for 10% of all teams to come back into the office, we devised a priority process very much based on the difficulties some staff were experiencing from working from home. So 100% of our housing team were the first ones that I got back into the office for the reasons that I've just explained. The accounts team and the finance team were more than happy to continue to work from home. So 100% of those guys continued to work remotely. And simply by listening to one of those conversations and picking up on some of the difficulties that one housing officer was having, enabled me to structure our whole return to office policy around a prioritization basis and a needs basis, rather than simply looking, as I said, as a one-size-fits-all approach. And taking the time to listen to those staff, again, provides really good opportunities for us as public sector leaders to make a difference in areas where it counts. And those housing teams were incredibly grateful that they were able to come back into the office, because it made their day-to-day transactions with some of those calls so much easier, and they meant that they weren't putting their friends and family in the firing line for some of those conversations. Taking time to listen, working behind the scenes, and just doing what you can to oil the wheels, for me, is a far more important part of where strategic leadership really counts in an unknown environment like COVID than trying to have all the answers up front. Next slide, please. So the other thing which struck me as important, again, we're often really good at thinking we need to take a leading role in helping the communities, and local authorities need to be front of some of those particular work streams and opportunities that we're providing. And I'm well aware that in some public facing roles such as police and fire and rescue, there clearly is a real need to take a command and control approach to make sure that people aren't putting themselves in immediate danger. But again, it soon became apparent as the COVID crisis rolled on that our front-facing and delivery service and our ability to continue to take a leading role in delivering those services was sustainable in the long term. And I refer to this as a community paradigm. So how can local authorities and the public sector generally facilitate and help others to help themselves? We're really good at providing a whole range of different response mechanisms, but we're not necessarily, in my opinion, quite so good at creating a sustainable environment and allowing community and voluntary groups and providing them with the help and support they need in order to be able to create that environment that they can then go forward and flourish and provide a far more long-term support mechanism to the members of the communities that really need it. And I think COVID gave us a fantastic opportunity to do that, largely through Boris's army of national volunteers and the brilliant local community and voluntary groups that were established. That, in my view, again, was quite unusual for local authorities and our emergency response. We're not usually faced with quite so much in the way of community assistance, but that provided a brilliant foundation. What do you as community and voluntary groups need from us? And we will facilitate that process by working with you, which will be a far more long-term means of making sure that the communities and businesses are getting what they need. So it's summed up there in terms of we need to loosen the reins and focus attention on how to support others to support themselves. And that's what a community paradigm is all about. How do we give power to the people and strength to communities to make sure that we're allowing them to go forward and really add that value as they work with their businesses and communities? So it's far more about facilitation than direct delivery. And that was something, again, for me, which was a bit of an eye-opener, having been used to providing that direct support. So as well as providing that the basis for communities to work really well for themselves, one of the other things that was really obvious to me from talking to some of the staff is that they were really concerned that as well as managing the COVID crisis, there was a need or an expectation, certainly amongst some of our local councillors, that there would be an element of business as usual and projects taking place alongside some of the COVID response. And staff were clearly quite concerned about that and worried that they wouldn't be able to deliver both a community response and deal with their day-to-day projects. And this was something which was really coming out strongly as a concern for them. So again, I guess a bit of an example of oiling the wheels and having those conversations to create them that space. I very quickly set up some conversations with some of our lead members and our council groups. And as part of our COVID response plan, I made it clear that there were going to need to be a number of projects that were put on the back burner, because clearly we weren't going to be in a position to deliver absolutely everything. And that was a really interesting conversation, because although some of the councillors accepted the fact that COVID needed to be the priority, I was finding, again, through some members of staff, that they were still getting some emails from members asking about the tourism review or asking about the review that was taking place. So clearly the messaging wasn't landing in some of those areas. And that's where, again, it's important to make time to listen to the officers and for them to be confident and competent to be able to raise any concerns with you. And from raising those concerns, I was then able to go specifically to some of those officers, so some of those councillors, and reiterate the message that we've got to essentially reprioritise our priorities, and the tourism review wasn't going to be done in a number of weeks. It would probably take months, or we may even have to postpone that piece of work altogether, because the lead officer was very much involved in the COVID response. And as part of that, the message was able to then land with some of our key councillors, and then across our organisation, we ended up with a position where lots of the councillors, if not all the councillors, were satisfied that some of those work streams would have to take a back seat. And that was incredibly important then for the staff, because it created them that space to be able to manage the COVID response, and not have to worry about getting emails from councillors about projects that they were running. So it's about managing those expectations. And a key piece of the work there in relation to our recovery was I went to great pains to make sure that all our councillors were aware that our recovery plan needed to be dynamic, and it could be stepped down at any time if we had to move back into a response mode, which actually is something we found really quickly as we've now gone into lockdown too. So managing expectations and helping others help themselves was something which for me was something which was a good learning opportunity, and something which provided the staff with that mechanism to enable them to get to the frontline COVID response. Okay, next slide, please, Nicole. So again, the implications of lockdown too. I mean, this is really interesting, isn't it? And again, we're finding ourselves in a really, really difficult environment. And I think when COVID first hit, there was very much the art of surprise. People listened to the government messages. The government messaging was really clear. Stay home, save lives, protect the NHS was a clear message that people responded to, and largely the levels of compliance we saw were really, really high. But again, naturally, as time has passed and people are now starting to get COVID fatigue, they're struggling with some of the messaging. There's been, again, some headspace for some to look to challenge some of the science, and for some political game playing to start creeping into the mix. And inevitably, what's happened there is that to some, the messaging is less clear, and in a desire to try and balance helping the economy with the public health message, then there are, and we're all seeing this across the country, pockets of people trying their luck or challenging some of the government messaging that's coming around. Now, we all know who's going to be in the firing line for that challenge, and it's going to be our services. It will be our COVID compliance officers, it will be our police, fire and rescue colleagues. It will essentially be anybody who is a direct point of contact with those businesses or communities that would be looking to air some of those frustrations around the government messages with anybody that will listen. And clearly our service staff are going to be in the firing line. And that's come at the worst possible time. I've summed it up there as adrenaline crash. Our frontline services are fatigued. They've been working non-stop since March, and they are now still in the front line, but dealing with a very different dynamic in terms of the businesses and communities that they were initially dealing with. So again, part of our leadership journey needs to be, how do we continue to support them and create that sustainable environment that means that they can keep their morale and their motivation going? And this is something which, again, I don't mind sharing with you. I'm struggling with how we do this to best effect. The teams are small, and we're not in a position to simply be able to bring in lots of additional agency staff and put staff on rotas whereby we can rest some staff and then stand other staff up and have some sort of cyclical basis. I'm working with really small environmental health teams of maybe only a dozen officers who are responsible for quite a large borough and for getting that messaging out there. And they're coming back to me on a regular basis and relaying some of the concerns they're having on the front line. And it's a really difficult one to manage. And again, it comes back to wanting to have all the answers. But this, for me, has been one of the learning points of the journey, is around how do we create that environment and how do we take the staff on those journeys with us, and how do we essentially manage to keep them going and create that sustainable environment. And it's really, really difficult. And it's about working as well as we can with our businesses. I'll regularly speak to our businesses, and I've said to any of the frontline staff that are getting complaints Let me know who's making those complaints, and I'm happy to have conversations directly with those businesses or community groups. Because again, I think as a leader, we're in a position where we need to support our teams, and that means taking the rough with the smooth. And for me, if I can help with some of that messaging, and I'd rather somebody vented their spleen at me than vented their spleen at one of the frontline service officers who are out there doing the very best job they possibly can. And I've relayed that to our members as well and our counsellors, and said, please let me know if you're getting any areas of concern, and I'll quite happily personally pick those up and see what can be done, because there is an element about taking that responsibility directly and giving those frontline staff some of the breathing space. It's again a small example, but it's an example of where we can help to try and create that sustainable environment. And in that planning for recovery, we talk around how we support our businesses and our communities around recovery, but I think we just need to pause and say, well, what does recovery look like for our frontline services? And again, one of the things I was really keen to do with our teams here at Tewkesbury was make sure they were directly involved in what the recovery process looked like. And I was really keen to make sure I understood what recovery meant for them. And recovery for them was around how can we reprioritise some of our routine work, like food inspections, licensing inspections, all the various work that environmental health are dealing with on a regular basis. But for them, recovery was around how we transition back into a business as usual, and how we set up the organisational processes to best support them. So we did a lot of that reprioritisation work, and I was really fortunate to be able to facilitate some external workshops and set those up with those key managers and heads of service and team leaders to say, right, let's really talk about what recovery for your service areas looks like. Let's park recovery for businesses and communities at the moment, and let's talk around what our organisational recovery needs to look like. And let's talk about how we need to reprioritise some of your work streams and some of the problems that you're facing, so we can make sure that the organisation goes on to be stronger as we come out of the COVID crisis. And the teams really appreciated that, because I don't think they'd necessarily felt that they were going to get that opportunity to shape up what recovery looked like for them. They felt that recovery was going to be all about what we did for the businesses and communities out there, and that they would have to by default take on an element of business as usual. So one of the things I'd really advocate, if you've not already done it, or if you're in the processes of looking at recovery, make sure if you can, you involve as many of those staff in those processes. And also strongly consider the idea of external facilitation. It's always interesting when you sit in on meetings, even though I like to think I'm pretty approachable and people can say exactly what they like to me and it's not going to cause offence. People sometimes feel a bit awkward about raising queries or problems or concerns with senior management. And by having an external facilitator in those sessions who's then able to feed back the headlines to you, and by not taking part in those sessions directly, you tend to find that you get a far more inclusive conversation, and lots of questions and comments will come out that people would sometimes otherwise feel nervous around asking at a staff meeting or another session. So planning for recovery is really, really important, but from an internal perspective as well as what we might be looking to do externally. And for us, how do we look to take the best part of technology, but also identify where some of those face-to-face meetings will need to take place and continue to take place. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I just want to finish. One of the things which really struck me as a benefit, if you can call it a benefit, of the COVID pandemic is because no one had the answers, people were really inclusive in the conversations that they had. And people were happy to sit down and say, what do we want to do and how do we solve this problem collectively? And I found that members of teams who were usually quite quiet or reserved were speaking up and putting examples of potential solutions into the mix. And people were happy to listen to those and take those on board because nobody had the answers. And it was a brilliant example of a really inclusive approach to problem solving and working together that isn't always seen in day-to-day environments, because naturally some people will be more outgoing than others. And naturally, some people will be subject matter experts, which clearly means that some of those newer or shy members of the team may not get their opportunity to speak. But because COVID was so new to everybody, there was that level playing field. and people were working together to try and identify solutions. And no suggestion was a silly suggestion, and actually some of the suggestions which we almost dismissed at first hand came to be some of the best solutions to deal with some of the issues that we faced. And for me, I think it's trying to harness that COVID mindset, and how do we break down those barriers and harness that mindset where no suggestion is a silly suggestion, and we really do break down those barriers where people feel happy to work together and try and make that the new normal as we work and move forward. So thank you, Nicole. That was very much a whistle-stop tour through some of the trials and tribulations that we were facing here at Tewkesbury, part of the COVID going. And we share the pain with many of our public sector colleagues and our businesses and communities. It would be easy to talk about this all day, but I'm happy, Nicole, at this point, if there's any questions, to try and take those or open it up for conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. That was fantastic. Tony, I can answer this question. There will be recordings available, hoping by the end of the week it'll be a series of YouTube links that we circulate. We have a hand up. Joy, have you got a question or comment? If you do, you may be on mute. I'm gonna
oh, sorry, none. Thank you.
Any more questions or comments? If anyone's got their hand up right now and I can't see it, please feel free to just shout out, because yeah, I'm having a few issues with the hands up button. Yeah, I think you've answered everyone's questions, Rob.
That's okay. Yeah, I was just having a look down the chat as well and just seeing what's coming out there. Yeah, there's a couple of comments. I think, yeah, anyone representing official doom is seen as fair game on the rant on the latest restrictions. I think that is a fair comment. And to some extent, it's inevitable, isn't it? People look to their local authorities as that messenger and that conduit between government and the local level. And I guess the other thing, which I'm quite happy to sort of level with as part of this conversation, seeing as it's a warts and all conversation, is it has been incredibly difficult to keep up with a lot of the detail, a lot of the information coming out of BEIS and MHCLG, as well as some of the information that's going directly to some of our business groups, has been incredibly difficult to keep up to speed with. And that's one of the challenges I've had, because again, we do feel as leaders that we should have all the answers. And if we get a call from one of our local businesses, we should be able to answer them in terms of what the local LEP is doing or how the business grant process is running. Same from members of our communities. I was getting lots of inquiries from food banks about how we would be able to help them, and we set up quite a few community grant funds to try and help them. But it was questions around, well, what are the restrictions in terms of us delivering our food parcels? And it was really quite difficult, and I was finding myself having to say, well, leave that with me. I'll go away and do a bit of research. And again, it emphasises that we can't have all the answers to our fingertips at times like this.
Perfect. Thanks, Rob. We've had a couple of questions come through. So you mentioned that there were difficulties setting up the cells at first. How did you resolve these issues and difficulties?
Yeah, the sales one was really interesting, and I suppose, having said it was a great way to break down the silos, it was instigated with an element of command and control, and it was essentially me saying, right guys, we haven't got the luxury of each individual service area working individually to try and resolve these matters, so you will get together and work closely as a group because you've got those complementary skill sets. Once that had been done, however, the initial nervousness of those teams coming together, because they'd not really met each other in any great detail beforehand, they really enjoyed working well together, and they worked out the best way to do that amongst themselves. And they were actually saying, not long into the process, we should have done this ages ago, thanks for setting it up. So I was quite lucky that once I brought the people together, they worked it out for themselves, and it was a natural progression from there, really.
Yes, and building on that, what's one thing that you would do differently in hindsight?
Yeah, good question. I think it would have been looking to set up the cells sooner. We spent a bit of time looking to use our traditional emergency planning forums and platforms, as I'm sure lots of local authorities did. I guess it would have been, for me, it would have been about setting up the cells sooner and it would have been bringing in some direct community voices to those sales sooner as well. We were so focused on trying to get those business grants set up and running in particular, that it was only a few weeks into the process that we were really engaging with some of those community groups. I would like to have brought them in from the outset. And actually part of our emergency planning pro forma has now been revised to make sure we're bringing those community groups in from the outset where necessary to get the messaging out, because they're so well placed to then go out there and do a lot of the hard work for us.
And just one more from us. How can we at the Office of Product Safety and Standards ensure that we are in tune with the concerns of local authority staff as we hopefully all move back to business as usual?
Yeah, I think one of the things that people look to MHCLG and OPPS in particular for is some guidance and reassurance. And I think one of the single biggest things that OPSS could really do that would be great is look to support the local authorities in trying to decipher the guidance. We've already started, as I'm sure lots of authorities have, with some businesses that have started to open up, which clearly shouldn't have done. And before we're taking that legal action, it's great to look to the likes of OPPS and the LGA and say, look, we've got a scenario here. Can we bounce some ideas off you? What's your view on whether this is an essential business, or what's your view on whether we're likely to struggle to take enforcement action if we were to close this business? And maybe for us to have a more open dialogue and just have that open two-way conversation. Again, I think that sometimes there's a bit of reluctance for us to have that open discussion because we're worried that we may be held to account, particularly on some of the advice that we're given. But I think local authorities are really quite happy to just have a bit of a sounding board and to use colleagues like yourself as a sounding board. So it's about the freedom to have those discussions. I think it would be really, really important.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Rob. Great presentation. Thanks everybody for attending. You can all go and enjoy your lunch now. Our next session starts at 1 p.m. and we've got 3 workshops of fire, trading standards and environmental health. So if you haven't signed up and you want to, please drop us an email to the local regulatory delivery inbox and we can get that sent over to you before they start. But with that, enjoy the rest of your day and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, all. Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks all.